Hi, I'm Hannah Brents. I am a licensed independent clinical social worker in Massachusetts and a registered yoga instructor with a private practice in Massachusetts. I have a bachelor's and master's degree in religious studies, and I've seen firsthand how fundamentalist and cultic religious communities can be so damaging. So thanks for being here. Before we jump into today, remember to press the red button and subscribe to the Theology Therapist channel and press the little bell so you can get notifications on all new weekly updates. If you find any of this helpful, I would love if you would share with a friend or tell us and leave a comment below. So let's get started. So today we want to talk about the causes of religious trauma. I'm gonna pop up an image here on the screen and we'll link it below. This was an image created by Marlene Weinell, who was the person who first coined the term religious trauma syndrome. And so really when anybody is talking about religious trauma syndrome, and if they're giving you a definition, they are using, most likely, this definition created by Marlene Weinell. And so she also created this image to talk about what are the causes of religious trauma and how does it happen? And so I want to walk through it with you today. So first we need to think about the environment in which a person is placed whenever religious trauma occurs. When religious trauma happens, what tends to be the case is that religion and church are the authority. These two entities are the authority and they are cut off. So these authorities, because we're thinking about religious trauma, we're not thinking like normal, church settings or normal, like you go to synagogue or you go to temple and it's fine. But what we are thinking about is when we're in fundamentalist communities, it's an authoritarian environment, the leadership is authoritarian, or when we're in, a cult type environment. So these are much more extreme, right? And in these environments, there is, since the church and religion is the ultimate authority, the people under them, the people in them, are cut off from what are typically other sources of authority. So think psychology, science, history, culture, sex, right? So history is something that's really important. Often history in these groups, in these environments, history is often sort of rewritten or retold to fit the narrative that this group, whatever the group is, that this group is professing. First thing, or the biggest thing to know about the cause of religious trauma is that religious trauma happens in isolation, that you are isolated from other sources of information. We've talked about religious trauma here before. So if you haven't watched it, go back and watch it, right? What we know about religious trauma is that there is information control happening. And so then this makes a lot of sense how it develops because there's a lack of information. And when you're inundated with the same amount of information, with the same information, you're like, this is just the way it is, right? No. So the first cause and the first thing to really know and get about religious trauma and why it happens is understanding where the information is coming from and why. The second cause, or the second factor to consider in religious trauma is that toxic doctrines are taught within these communities. These toxic doctrines are pushed, really. So you have first one of fear. Fear is huge. Oftentimes, if you are not only following this channel, but if you follow other channels about deconstructing faith, or if you're deep in the deconstruction, then you've probably heard people kind of make jokes about how within these communities they say do this or you're gonna burn in hell, or they talk to kids like that, do this or you're gonna burn in hell. And I think that that's kind of extreme, I don't, I don't know, like maybe it does happen that way, but I don't know that it's like so explicit. I think oftentimes it's implied. And then like what you might have happen is you might be a kid and you might lie about something to get away with something, right? Because that's what kids do. And so then you might have to read about in the Bible, like the Christian Bible, and I believe it's actually in the Hebrew Bible as well. So all across the board, there's this section that says like there are 7 things that the Lord hates, and one of them is lying. And so all of a sudden you're this kid who lied because you're a kid, and then all of a sudden now you're like doing these things that like the Lord hates, and so, you know, and you're definitely not going to get into heaven if the Lord hates what you're doing. Okay, and so that's what I mean, like, silly example, but that's what I mean when I think there are times maybe when it's more explicit in these communities about, okay, so there are all of these swaths of people who are going to hell or not making it into heaven, but the fear, that seed of fear, is really implanted. If you do all of these things, then you are separated from God, and you won't reach the ultimate goal, which would be to be with God in heaven, or whatever the language for that is in your religious context. And so fear is used. Fear is used to control behavior. And then the next step of that really is shame and guilt. I'm sure that you know what I'm talking about. Shame and guilt. So fear first is used, and then whenever there's been like a transgression, so whenever there's been something that has happened that has gone against whatever the teachings are, orthodoxy, then shame and guilt are utilized to correct that behavior and into the behavior that the community would agree with. It's kind of hard to be perfect, right? And so in the course of being human, we end up experiencing this shame and guilt quite a lot because we mess up a lot. We're just human. And so then we become accustomed, we grow accustomed to this experience of shame and guilt. And if you know anything about Brene Brown, guilt says, like, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. And so when shame and guilt are used hand in hand, when they are the operative modes of correcting behavior, then we interpret the message to be, we understand the message to be that we are bad. Marlene Winell says, like, the third toxic doctrine that is used in these communities would be fantasy. I think when she's talking about this, she would, like, you can imagine fantasy to be like magical thinking. And so that magical thinking is what happens often in religious communities, not only in fundamentalist ones, like saying, pray and this sickness is going to go away. It's the belief that doing something is going to change the outcome of something else when it actually has no bearing on it. Fantasy is using like this magical thinking and probably neglecting any sort of critical thinking. What else happens in religious trauma as a cause of religious trauma is harmful childcare practices. So the first one is punishment. So I think that this happens in much more, I would say, extreme environments, in like very authoritarian, very like fundamentalist, although it doesn't have to be the case, religious communities. So sometimes punishment, like, you know, the Bible or a religious text, not even the Bible, but a religious text can be used as support for like physically harming or punishing a child, right? There's that like famous Bible verse that says, spare the rod, spoil the child. So if you like, spare the rod is like what they used to use to spank children, right? Like switch from a tree. And so, if you spare the rod, then you spoil the child. So that can be used if you don't physically hit or punish this child, then they're going to be spoiled. And so that can be used and then taken out of context and misused and actually used to hurt kids. So that's one way. Another way is through isolation. So kids, right, if you remember just the initial environment that religious trauma happens in, so the environment of like information control. So that also happens not only with information, but just with like people themselves, contact, if you will, with the outside world. So you might be isolated from the outside world. This is especially true if you go to a religious school or if you are homeschooled. So those are two big ways that isolation can take place in kids. And then impossible expectations, right? So there are really high expectations that can be placed on kids. And then using fear that we talked about, and then using shame and guilt to correct that behavior. What all of this does is causes developmental delays. Developmental delays can happen emotionally, intellectually, socially, and sexually. So this can happen emotionally when if you are under this, you have this upbringing, oftentimes like you don't learn how to manage difficult emotions. There are some emotions that are okayed, basically, and then there are other emotions that are bad or off limits, like women, for example, and a lot of times anger is very off limits. Women aren't like supposed to be angry, and so that can stunt the emotional development of a person, of a child. And especially if this happens not only within like the religious context, but that goes even further to happen at home, because the home is like this sort of mini environment, if you will, and then the church, that religious context, is the macro environment. And so that mini environment, right? So if at home, not only in like the religious community, but at home, the emotional, like there isn't emotional expression, that can delay any sort of like emotional development or the type of comfort with expressing yourself or being able to have that emotional intelligence, right? Intellectual delays or developments. Remember when we were talking about that information control at the beginning, we were talking about cultural, science, psychology, like those things, history, and that how history can even be like changed. Culture is like seen as very bad. So when something like history can be rewritten, I'm from Texas, and the curriculum writers wanted to put in, I remember this like growing up, I think they're still like even talking about it, but they wanted to put in like the public school curriculum that like Moses and Abraham or something like that were founding fathers of the US. Like, what? And that's in the public school. So crazy. So that's what I'm talking about with, if that can happen in like the public school system, which is like a state controlled entity, think about, which is like completely obviously rewriting history. Think about what can happen in like one of these isolated, insulated religious communities. So that can present like this sort of intellectual developmental delay. Not that there's like an intellectual disability, but that intellectual delay in that there are things that you have to catch up on. Social delays, that happens so easily when you grow up in such an insulated environment, especially if you went to a private religious school, if you were homeschooled, especially. Social delays can happen because you aren't connected to culture. You don't know what's happening. You don't know what everybody else your age is talking about. And so it can take a while to, like, you miss cultural references, especially if after you've left that environment. I'll give you a quick, easy example. When I was growing up, I was who Harry Potter was written for. Like, that was my age, basically. and I wasn't allowed to read it because there's magic and stuff like that. Ironic, given how much we've talked about how magical thinking is used. So I was who Harry Potter was written for. I was not allowed to read it. And so because of that, I completely missed this huge cultural phenomenon. Lastly, sexual. I can't say this enough. I've talked about it a little bit here, but a cause of religious trauma can be seen in sexual delays because of the fear that's utilized and then the guilt and shame, right? And so sex is only talked about as bad. This is bad. Don't do it at any cost. Whatever. If you do, you're tainted forever and broken, whatever. And so you're not given proper information about sex, like anatomy, like how, what are your parts and how, whatever. So there can be really huge sexual delays, if you've experienced any sort of religious trauma. So I want to wrap up here because this was a lot. Religious trauma can develop because of a lot of things. Like this type of culture, this type of environment is so all-encompassing. It just it includes so much of your everyday, just your whole being, right? And so because of that, it is so hard. It can impact your life in so many ways. So I hope that you found some of this helpful, maybe some of it to be illuminating, this is why connects with my experience, right? If so, leave us a comment, let me know how this was for you, if you agree, if you disagree. Be well, can't wait to see you next week.